This is one of the toughest follow-ups I've ever had to do, and I hope you will bear with me on that one. I think after the lecture that we've just heard from Steve, my disclaimer that I put into the first slide hopefully is not even necessary, but I do feel that I have to emphasize this not only as a scholar but also as a human being, as an entity who's spent a good part of the past 20 years working in the Middle East, but in fact predominantly in Syria. In fact, if I add up the years or the days that I have spent in Syria, I am easily in years at this point. So I hope I'll be forgiven by the Syrians present in emphasizing that when I look at what's happening in Syria nowadays, it's also happening to my country. The fact that we're feeling defensive about protecting cultural heritage comes out of the fact that we're confronted with questions that are difficult, if not impossible, to answer. How many artifacts are worth a human life is a question that for the first time I was confronted with 10 years ago, as Dan had mentioned, when I was working in Chicago on helping recover artifacts or cultural heritage from the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. For the first time I was really confronted with the fact that losing a museum or losing cultural heritage is not just an artifact-based loss, not something we can tally up in money, but it is a very real loss. And I was noting down the basics that Steve had just lined out as human essentials, water, food, shelter, and medical care. And I started realizing that there might be another point that one could add to this list, and that is, you can call it dignity or identity that goes with it, and I don't think there would be any dispute on that one. It is partly this factor, the dignity and identity, that I see behind the preservation of cultural heritage, to which I will dedicate this talk. So my answer to how many artifacts are worth a human life, there's only one thing wrong about it, and that is the question, because this is a no-no. No one has put this question into real, fortunately, no one's really put this question down in a real situation, and I hope it's not coming up. It's a nonsensical question. In moving on to the topic of my discussion, I want to clarify terminology. I have consciously avoided the word antiquity or antiquities here in order to make it clear that we're not denoting commercial monetary value to the material that we're studying. I'm not an antiquities dealer. I do not know what things are worth. I don't even care about it. To me, everything is priceless, ultimately. This is why I prefer to talk about cultural heritage, because we cannot and shall not attach price tags to it. But also because ultimately cultural heritage is something that defines humans and ultimately humanity. I have structured my presentation in 4 points that very tangibly can be traced in Syria right now pertaining to cultural heritage. The first one will address, I think, the most visible one, danger to world heritage sites that are well known in Syria. The second one, danger to museums and collections in Syria. The third one very close to my heart, danger to archaeological sites. And the fourth one, and probably the most pressing one on certain levels, especially in light of the previous talk, is the danger that archaeological personnel, museum personnel, and people who put their lives in the line of danger to protect cultural heritage are facing in Syria. The danger posed to World Heritage Sites in Syria is probably most easily or tangibly presented by being very empirical and simply highlighting a couple that have suffered tremendous damage already in the past few years. Most people will have heard about the famous site of Palmyra, the home of Queen Zenobia, who so bravely faced the Romans, a magnificent desert oasis, well known from postcards all over the world. Here you see the sunrise over the famous Great Procession Street in Palmyra. Its key sanctuary is the Baal Temple, one of those great enigmas of temple constructions in the Near East, unifying Eastern as well as Western traditions. Really, I think for many of us who go there, not only a major tourist attraction, but truly sacred ground. Alas, it was not immune to shelling. It was severely damaged in 2012. You can see some of the damage that it has sustained. And in fact, it only highlights the fact that, unfortunately, a site as famous and significant as Palmyra has become a battleground between various factions in the civil war. Here you see certain images showing tanks in position, in strategic positions within the ruins as such, and obviously taking no account of the fact that this is a World Heritage Site. A site that might be less well known is the city of Apamea, although most of us implicitly have heard about it one way or the other. For this is the site where the famous Quirinus, the governor of Syria, who instituted the census that's mentioned in the Bible, was located. It was actually at that point one of the largest cities in the world. It supposedly contained at least 500,000 people and almost rivaled, well, Rome was of course the largest city at that point, but at its size at that point, it really had no rival in the Middle East. This is one of the most famous views that many of us who've been to Syria have seen, and in fact, if you go to our own gallery of Rome and the ancient Near East, you can see video footage of, well, me standing there as late as December 2010, narrating stories about this magnificent site. We went there on a wonderful trip through Syria. Little did I know it was going to be my last one in God knows how many years. Seeing a lush and green and beautiful country with everyone being very happy and helpful, and us traveling around and having, as I said, very little of an idea that it was the last time in a long time to come. Even a site such as Apamea was not immune to military action. In March 2012, it saw severe shelling. It is, for me, difficult to assess what the damage is, but it is sizable from everything that we've seen so far. I will return to the topic of Apamea in a different context, the looting of archaeological sites later on. Other parts of Apamea, the Islamic citadel which is still inhabited, and actually the location of the modern settlement, fared no better. As you can see from this video shot here, you can see that it is being shelled and also severely damaged. One of the most famous monuments in Syria, of which not only people visiting Syria, but many Westerners who study medieval history easily will have heard, is the Crusader Castle, Crac de Chevalier, a must on every tourist trip, located high above and controlling the valley that connects the coast to the Syrian urban corridor, with basically the avenue leading towards the cities of Hama, Homs, and ultimately Damascus. An invincible place, and in fact a place that had never been conquered. It finally was abandoned by the Crusaders and turned over to the Islamic conquerors. But even the Crac, which is featured on Syrian's currency, here you see the 25-pound note with the picture of the Crac, was not immune to military conflict. Here you see the castle sustaining a major hit. I have seen video footage. The damage that you see is sizable. It's actually quite atrocious, and it will be very difficult to figure out if it's possible to even repair what has been done to it. The startling thing is that not only archaeological sites that deal with the more distant past are being targeted or become victims to shelling, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional, but monuments that really are sacred and an integral part of much of Syria's population's personal beliefs, and certainly places that are literally quite holy to a majority of the population. Few people may have heard about the Al-Mari Mosque in Bosra, one of the oldest mosques in the world, which was shelled and partially destroyed in April of 2013. But most people, one way or the other, will probably have heard about the attacks on the old city of Aleppo. Aleppo is one of those quintessential medieval cities that one literally has to see to believe. It is dominated by its citadel, the ancient location, in fact, of the settlement of Aleppo, which goes back far into prehistory and was a dominant, flourishing city as early as 2000 BC. What you see here, in fact, under the citadel mount are archaeological layers that are literally bleeding out of the ground. Here's its wonderful doorway from the Mameluke period, for which you can enter this wonderful castle. But Aleppo is fascinating on so many levels because as you walk through the city, you can see how it emulated and incorporated so many elements of the past. I'm just putting two random examples out here. A Roman triumphant arch that was turned into a mosque that is sitting there. It's one of the oldest mosques in Aleppo. And a Hittite inscription which is simply set into a mosque. A wonderful example of religious syncretism that you probably don't expect in anywhere in the Middle East, but which is very present and vibrant there. Most significant, I think, for most of us walking around there is the old souk, the economic area with the shops, with the workshops, which I'm showing you here in a couple of examples. A thriving example of an ancient city being totally alive, and in fact, every time I walked around there, I felt I stepped back in time. This is what happened to the city in December 2012. Another World Heritage Site, this time of gigantic proportion, had been destroyed. It burned out, and the damage that happened to it is still impossible to assess to us. This is not an isolated monument. This is a living element of the past that has been wiped out here, possibly for good. One of the key monuments in Aleppo is its Umayyad Mosque. Umayyad basically means it's going back to the first major Islamic dynasty. It dates, the building was begun in the late 7th century BC, so again it's one of the oldest mosques, but built at a grand scale. Here's a photograph of the inner courtyard as it used to look like. The Great Mosque was destroyed in the same fire that destroyed the ancient city of Aleppo as well. Here you see the fire and the aftermath. What had survived at first is its most iconic feature, the Great Minaret, one of the oldest minarets in the Islamic world. It survived, it was built in the 12th century, it survived all kinds of wars, it survived everything that happened in the 20th century. Well, it survived until April 2013, when it was probably accidentally hit and completely destroyed. I know that this sent a major shock and trauma, not only through the Islamic world, but it even resonated in the West. Did something like that? This is basically like taking down the dome of St. Peter, what you see here happening. I mentioned the dangers to museums and collections, and this is one that is much more or less tangible to us at this point because we simply do not get much data, so we are outsiders on this story. You've all heard about the looting of the Iraq Museum. I assume at least most of you have heard about it. I certainly have given numerous talks to that extent here in Toronto already. And it's a very likely scenario that something like this could happen in Syria as well. One of the museums at great danger, and in fact it very likely has been badly damaged, is the museum in Aleppo, which you see on the outside here, which has one of Syria's leading collections of priceless artifacts. And I might emphasize, collection is always one of those terms I'm not very happy with, because what you see here is essentially all excavated archaeological data. And because it is excavated, and because it has a provenance, it is, for us as scholars, it's just priceless. We don't know its fate, and we don't know the fate of the most famous piece from the Aleppo Museum, the so-called water galleys from Mari, which is again so famous that it shows up on Syria's currency. This is literally one of the most famous artifacts from the Middle East, and I cannot at this point tell you what its fate is. We don't don't really know what's happening to the National Museum's collection in Damascus, and I'm just putting randomly some of the highlights up because you will probably, as you look through it, and this is literally Syria through the millennia, from the basically from about 4000 to the medieval ages that I'm showing you here. One way or the other, you will have seen an artifact on here. We don't know what the fate of the collection is at this point, but as the fighting is drawing closer to Damascus, we have to be aware of the fact that it will be a great danger and peril as well. Not all is gold and silver that is significant to us in this context. Syria has recently produced numerous important key pieces in human evolution and human history, such as the discovery of this Neanderthal skeleton. In fact, there are many examples of Neanderthals now from Syria that have put a completely new dimension on the development of early humanoids, basically the forerunners of the spread of the Homo sapiens in this part of the world has developed various new angles that are still under investigation. We don't know what its fate is, as little as the fate of one of the most recent discoveries, a royal tomb at the site of Katna. Again, these artifacts, of course, are in great danger of being stolen, or in the case of gold, as it happens so frequently in this case, being melted down. The museum in Deir ez-Zor for sure has been suffering. This is a site in city in eastern Syria. The city of Deir ez-Zor has been thoroughly destroyed. I showed a small inset here, as have been some of the smaller museums in this province. I'm showing a photograph of the museum at the famous site of Dura Europos, which has been ripped to shreds. There's very little that we know about what exactly happened, except that the destruction has been fairly complete. The danger to archaeological sites is probably the least visible one to an outsider. This is less warfare that we're worried about here, but this is looting. Now, looting is something that we've known very well from Iraq already. I'm just flashing by a few images from Iraq showing archaeological sites having been looted. The problem here is not military action, but the economy, or the economic factors. People have nothing left to sell. They have nothing left to collect, so they're going for the one good that they can still get access to, and that is archaeological sites. The fact that it has started in Syria is very tangible from satellite images. I'm showing you Palmyra again here, the site that I've shown you earlier, the wonderful colonnaded street that has been shelled. This is a satellite image from July 2011, and I'm going to show you how it looks in April 2012. What you see popping up here, these holes are looter holes. This was a completely preserved city from the time of Christ that you saw here. It was never fully excavated. It could have told us a lot. It's now irrecoverably destroyed. Many sites in eastern Syria are made out of mud brick, or the buildings are made out of mud brick, and they're very difficult, therefore, to recognize, and probably generally perceived to be relatively safe because they're not screaming artifacts or potential for looting. But none of them are really safe because they're also literally out of sight of any control at this point. One reason why we archaeologists are so concerned about the sites per se is because we are ultimately forensic scientists in the field, although with much cruder techniques. We excavate, we record, we label in order to retain a paper trail of artifacts as they're being retrieved, such as I'm showing in this diagram here of little clay lumps that in itself are completely devoid of a story. And as you look at them in archaeological context, they're clay sealings that actually tell you about the development of primitive and yet at the same time very complex bureaucracies as early as 3500 BC. The last topic I want to mention, and in fact relatively shortly because I really do not want to illustrate it for good reasons, is the danger to archaeologists and museum personnel. This is the probably most tangible one and the closest that I can get to our previous speaker in this respect, because it is a very real threat. Archaeologists have been threatened, some of them have been injured, and a few of them likely have been killed because they are unaccounted for at this point. This is more than the loss of an unreachable elite. There are many archaeologists in Syria. I have been teaching classes at the University of Damascus and encountered up to 400 students per class, which is something we fortunately don't have to face here in Toronto, because then there wouldn't be any jobs for them. But it just shows the tremendous interest and as well the need for archaeological personnel in a landscape that ultimately, fundamentally, is one single large archaeological artifact. It is a challenge to make sure that these scholars are being taken care of, and I'm pleased to say that UNESCO has stepped in and created the Scholars Rescue Fund, specifically helping Syrian colleagues. And I'm pleased to say that some of them, in fact, the colleague in the picture, is already in safety and hopefully can resume her work and her research far away from the dangers of the Syrian civil war. What can you do? I think ultimately this is a much more difficult list to compile than in terms of how to help doctors and medical personnel. What I would ask you to do is to stay away from making any potential profit of this dilemma, of this conflict. Be suspicious of anyone that offers you anything from Syria at this point. Don't buy. Contact us. Contact law enforcement if you see something. You're not helping anyone if you buy artifacts from Syria. You're helping the middleman. You don't help the average citizen, the average worker that sells his own past for literally a few pennies at that point, because he's too desperate to think otherwise at that point. Don't do it. If you see something that looks suspicious, call the police or call customs. Preserving human heritage, preserving cultural heritage in Syria goes past Syria per se. It affects us all. It's all of our heritage. And in this, I think I can close the cycle of the previous lecture, because ultimately we're trying, one way or the other, preserve humanity in this dreadful conflict. Thank you very much.